I think this is doing the next one.
Do you want to start forming at 6:35?
I don't know.
Shall we? All right, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Research to Action lecture series organized by the Economic Democracy Initiative and the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. My name is Pavlina Cherneva, and I'm a professor of economics at Bard and the director of the Economic Democracy Initiative. We established this lecture series, the Research to Action lecture series, in order to bring policymakers, scholars, activists in conversation with students on issues of critical importance. And there are many looming challenges, but few of which are as important as the green transition. So today we'll turn our attention to public utilities, public renewables, and we have a very special guest who I will introduce to you in a moment. But I want to talk back a little bit about a time in the past when the importance of direct government investment was the consensus view. After the Great Depression and during the early post-war period, policymakers acted on the basis of an understanding that for certain kinds of investments, the most direct, immediate, and yes, financially sustainable solution to various social needs was for the government to provide essential public goods like clean water, clean air, electricity, schools, public transportation, etc. Now, the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority during the New Deal used federal funding to build hydroelectric dams and power plants across the Tennessee Valley, providing electricity to rural communities, and managing flood control. The Public Works Administration during the New Deal funded construction of public utilities like water, sewer system in many communities. The Hoover Dam protected Arizona and Southern California from the Colorado River's destructive floods, providing drinking water and electricity to utilities in the region. Now, these were not just massive infrastructure projects to deal with the Depression. They were direct investments in communities in need in the future. They built the middle class, if you will. They provided for so much rural development and the like. Now, these were also massive employment projects, and they gave birth to the American middle class. Now, economists subsequently spoke of the need to have something called natural monopolies, where they might be a single company supplier of a product or service to consumers in cases where there are very large, high fixed costs and barriers to entry. And the argument was that it was inefficient to have redundancy, to have duplication of electric grids, of sewer systems, of bridges, and that these were essential needs. They had to be done, and the government made those investments. Now, government didn't always own the utilities. Some were privately owned, but they were very strictly regulated, and the idea was that they were not allowed to exploit their exorbitant privilege, to be in that unique position to be the single supplier of something essential and then price gouge their customers. Now, much of this had changed in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, deregulation, defunding weakened public institutions in the name of competitive market solutions, which were absent, and they couldn't provide for these public goods to the communities. These changes led to massive disinvestments in public utilities, and then allowing private companies to manage these utilities actually allowed them to benefit from this privilege, often cutting services in the name of cost cutting and raising prices whenever possible. Some of us are experiencing this here in the Hudson Valley by looking at our electric bills, I think. But also there are these egregious, examples that we see across the nation with major blackouts, major power outages. And I'm not even going to discuss other problems with utilities like, the Michigan water crisis and how many communities there are in the United States that don't have access to clean water. Now, the argument about natural monopolies has shifted a little bit because there have been some technological innovations that have broken certain natural monopolies, like telecommunications. We used to have the landlines, and that seemed to be the most efficient way to provide telecommunications. And technology has allowed a bunch of companies to provide that, that service. It's not exactly true for all utilities. There are some innovations in energy provisioning, and that's interesting to note and see how that develops. But what is still true is that the role of the public sector is as important as ever, and that the government can not only do a lot of good, but often it is the only entity that can undertake the scale of investment that is necessary for the rapid transition to renewable energy. And there's no time. The climate crisis is not going to wait for us to reinvent the wheel. Luckily, we don't have to. We have some solutions right here in our backyard that we can look to, such as the New York Power Authority. So I'm especially pleased to introduce to you a leader in New York on these issues, New York State Assemblymember Sarahana Shrestha, representing the 103rd District, and a lifelong advocate for the working class, social justice, and climate issues. Sarahana was born in Nepal, and her view of justice and democracy was shaped by bearing witness to extreme wealth inequality, the intersection of ethnicity, caste, gender, religion, and class, as well as by the impact the addition of public goods can have on a community and their well-being. In the Hudson Valley, Sarahana found her bearings as a climate organizer. She joined campaigns to stop fossil fuel plants and to bring energy democracy to New York State. She decided to run for office because this moment of crisis demands bold action on everything that constitutes the safety net. And it's the safety net that has been a critical issue to the research and the work of the Economic Democracy Initiative. Issues of climate, housing, healthcare, public education, jobs, worker rights, and so much more. So please join me in welcoming Sarahana.
Okay, hello everyone. So if you were at the sign-in table, I'm gonna first start with pitching this yellow pamphlet that we have. This is some commonly asked questions about our bill to replace Central Hudson, which is our investor-owned utility for energy, with a publicly owned and democratic utility, which we have called the Hudson Valley Power Authority. So we introduced this bill earlier this year, and right now we've been going around knocking doors, getting support for it from really all kinds of people, people who don't vote, people who don't vote for Democrats, people who don't believe in big government, but somehow still don't think that Central Hudson should be for profit, that energy should be for profit. So there is a QR code out there to sign, put your name down in support of this bill, which we would love that because we're trying to get a lot of signatures across the Central Hudson Service Territory, which is primarily in the Hudson Valley, most of it. So with that said, I have a short presentation on the supply side of the energy system because one of the deregulations that happened in New York State after FDR's time, after he created the New York Power Authority, which is the country's largest publicly owned energy provider, and it was created in 1931 to counter the influence of businessmen in the energy sector, especially in this case, particularly hydropower. So lots of people thought that hydropower should not be in the hands of businessmen, that it should be in the hands of the public. And that's how New York Power Authority, to this day, is the main entity that manages New York's hydropower. So, what is the State Assembly? Lots of people don't know, so I always like to start here. The State Assembly is the lower chamber of the New York State Legislature. So we have the State Senate, we have the State Assembly, then we have the executive branch, which is the governor. Everything that happens in the legislature in terms of passing bills or passing funding goes through the same houses, so the State Senate and the State Assembly. Now the State Assembly in its size, you can see there's 150 Assembly members, is more than twice as big as the State Senate because we represent smaller districts, roughly about 135,000 people. So consensus building can be challenging in the Assembly. It's an obstacle that the Assembly often has that the State Senate right now does not have, because also the political dynamics of the state legislature have changed, because right now we have a Democratic supermajority, which is a fairly new thing. So we're not really in the New York State legislature trying to counter the influence of Republicans. We are trying to figure out what the Democratic supermajority should do, which in some way, compared to the federal challenges, is a much more exciting challenge to have. So I represent 14 towns and 19 local governments, and Northern Dutchess is part of this district. So we have, Red Hook, Rhinebeck, and the village of Red Hook, Tivoli, and so on. So, one thing to know about New York State is that, and this is like part of the breaking up of the natural monopolies that was just mentioned, if you are involved in the supply side of the energy, so building energy, you are not involved in the delivery side. So they during this deregulation, basically they decided that the supply side didn't have to be a natural monopoly, but the delivery side still had to, so it's completely separated. So Central Hudson does delivery, which is bringing the power from the grid straight to the end use. And then lots of people, different developers, private developers, do the generation of energy. And then where New York Power Authority comes in is they do the hydropower, but they also do a lot of transmission. And transmission is taking energy from where it was built to the grid, from where it's then taken to end use. So in 2019, we passed our climate goals, which was both ambitious and necessary. So there are many goals in there, but there are two that we are most concerned with right now, and one especially, which is the 2030 goal, because it's right around the corner. So just as a refresher, our 2030 goal is that at least 70% of our electric load should come from renewable energy. It doesn't say what type of, it's an imported, build, whatever. And then 2040, we want the statewide electrical demand system to be zero emission. So there's an emission goal as well. Now, we received a report. There was a report released last year that was an independent report that was commissioned by the Public Power New York Coalition. And that report said, and we had been sounding this alarm for a while, that we are not on track to meet our 2030 goals. We really had to create a lot of noise to actually make people believe that, because as we were saying we're not on track, the governor and New York Power Authority were saying we're so ahead. Don't worry, we're so ahead. And then, the independent report was released, and there was like, well, this is one report, we're gonna look at it, whatever. But now there's a new report. There's actually two reports. One from the state comptroller, which is more general, and it says we're not on track with our goals. Then there's a more extensive report from the Public Service Commission and NYSERDA, and that one is more damning. It basically says we're absolutely not on track. So here's what that report says. According to their estimate, by 2030, only 44% of our energy use will be renewable. Right now, it's about 25%, and most of that is from hydropower, which is old hydropower. You know, it's not any new sources of energy. And solar and wind combined is only at about 4%. It sort of hovers between 4% to 6%. So that's really bad. And this is despite all of the subsidies and the policy changes that we've made so that private developers can have an easier time building energy, except they are not having an easy time. And in fact, right now we are experiencing high cancellation rates. So that's why there's a push to revisit the climate goals. You know, the governor already said, well, that was before COVID-19, it was a different time. Maybe it's not really possible to meet these goals. And then there's also some people in the business sector who would be happy to roll these goals back, and there's also a push for maybe looking into nuclear, even though the state actually does not consider nuclear to be a renewable source. So 44% is better than 25, but it's not 70%. We want to be at 70%. This report estimates that 70% by 2030 would look like 115,000 gigawatts, and it's forecasting two things. One, it's forecasting what the demand will actually be, because there's also more electrification going on, there's more type of projects going on. For example, there are 2 microchip centers going online in this state that extensively adds energy load to the state's table, which I'm not very crazy about. So this is an estimate based on how much we think we will be using and how much renewable energy will have gone online by then, connected to the grid and ready to be served. So they estimate the deficit is around 42,000 gigawatts, which is very close to the worst case scenario estimate in our independent report. We really thought the worst case scenario would actually not be the scenario, but it's the PSC report is even slightly worse than the independent report. Now, why have private developers not been able to make the energy that we task them to make? These are some of the things that keep coming up. High interest rates, inflation, supply chain, workforce shortage, interconnection, which is when the energy is connected to the grid, and siting, which is finding a physical location to put the project in. Just as an example of the type of things that are happening, so last year, I believe it was last year or earlier this year, 5 private developers that were working on some offshore wind projects and 86 land renewable projects filed petitions asking for their contracts to be readjusted because they needed more money than they thought to be able to do these projects. And the Public Service Commission denied that request, basically saying this is an old contract, we can't change it. So the dilemma there is we do want more energy to go online, but we also can't put all our cards in this private sector that has been failing really for many years. So looking at these things, I'm going to get into how building public renewables is the thing that helps us address some of these things. So high interest rates, inflation, supply chain, workforce shortage, interconnection, and siting. So here's our demand. We want New York State to build at least 15 gigawatts of public renewables by 2030 and 5 gigawatts by 2026. Now the reason we can make this demand is last year we passed the Build Public Renewables Act, which was the bill I was working on as a volunteer climate organizer. And when I started meeting legislators to get their support on this bill, I faced disappointment, and that's how I decided to run for office. But we did pass this bill last year. So technically, it's being implemented, but it's in the planning phase. So New York Power Authority has not built anything yet, it's in the planning phase. So what exactly does this bill do? So it has many components, but I'm going to highlight the top 4 that we are concerned about. It has a climate mandate. It authorizes New York Power Authority to build new renewables or new energy because they were not even allowed to build new energy prior to this bill passing, because the private sector really wanted, the whole field to themselves, and they did not want to compete against a public entity. And they even said, in so many words, they don't want to compete with the public entity because the public entity would just be too good at it. They literally put a version of that argument in their memo of opposition. But we know that that is exactly the reason why we should build public renewables. So we gave them the authority to build renewables, which they didn't have, and we also directed NYPA to build enough to fill the gap that we have in our 2030 goals. So it's authority and it's direction. We also want them to close their gas peaker plants by 2030. So these are the toxic peaker plants that go online when the energy demand is high. So New York Power Authority owns many that are in environmental justice communities, mostly Black and brown communities, and they have expressed their desire to close them, but not really when and how. So we want it to be by 2030, and the way to do that is by replacing those sources of energy with public renewables. But we also know a big hurdle in the climate transition is affordability. So right now, the utility laws are set up in a way where the ratepayers bear the burden of all of the cost of the climate transition, and that is a very high price tag. So we cannot be in a gridlock about trying to protect the ratepayers and also trying to do this climate transition. We have to figure out a way to do both. And again, that's by removing as much as possible energy from the private sector. So this bill has a provision to create a program that uses the revenues from the public renewables to fund automatic bill discounts to low-income households in disadvantaged communities. And the state has already designated different communities as disadvantaged, so it's not anything new that this bill is creating. Then we also have gold standard labor language in this bill, really the first of its kind that was written in collaboration with AFL-CIO. We think that the energy transition should also be a source of wealth equity and worker empowerment and so on. So it has a provision where every NYPA project within this renewable authority has to have a project labor agreement, and there's also money available for training workers and also retraining workers that need to be transitioned from the fossil fuel sector. So let's talk about why it's cheaper. New York Power Authority is not funded by taxpayers or ratepayers. It is independently financed through its very highly rated bonds. And as a successful public entity, it can access low interest financing and tax-exempt bonds. This is one of the reasons immediately why private utilities are more expensive is because their cost of operation is very high. Just to do a comparison, in the most recent debt issued by Central Hudson versus New York Power Authority, New York Power Authority got their money at just above 3% interest rate. Central Hudson got it at just above 6% interest rate. And we're paying for that, and on top of that, we're also paying for the profit margin. So financing is a big deal. And additionally, the Inflation Reduction Act is a new, relatively new federal law that was passed, and it makes subsidies available for public entities for the first time. So previously, the subsidies were just for, the tax credits were just for private developers. Now, for the first time, New York Power Authority would also be able to bring federal dollars in the more energy that they build. And the reason this law passed is because of the realization that public intervention is absolutely necessary to having this transition. Without it, it's not going to happen. And that became more and more of a commonly accepted conclusion because of all of the organizing that's happening nationwide to fight for public power. And then, there are some things we want to make sure don't hurt localities where these type of projects come in. We want to make sure their property taxes are not lost, but we also want to give them additional benefits like the community benefit agreements that they can have with New York Power Authority. And unlike private projects, costs are not passed on to the ratepayers. You know, one of the reasons PSC rejected those petitions from the 5 developers is because that was going to pass more money to ratepayers. And unlike private projects, NYPA doesn't have to do only projects that are profitable. They can mix up their portfolio. They can do some projects that are very high risk. Maybe it'll never make them money, but they can match it with projects that are more lucrative. But either way, the way this would work is NYPA would build new energy and they would sell it in the existing wholesale market, and that's where they would get the revenues. Now the problem is the existing wholesale market is stacked with fossil fuel. There just is not an abundance of low-cost renewables in there, which is why, you know, utilities like Central Hudson, for example, primarily procure their energy from fossil fuel sources. Then we have the workforce. We want New York Power Authority to build 15 gigawatts of renewables by 2030 so that we can also create 25,000 green jobs. Depending on the exact projects that they want to do, we estimate it will be between 20,000 and 30,000 new jobs. We have the gold standard labor protections, and we have passed enough things in the state where it would make it possible for NYPA to partner with the Department of Labor and relevant trade unions to make sure we have enough workers. You know, people are dying to work, we just don't have the infrastructure for workforce development and also for creating good jobs. So this is what we think we can do with this project. And there is also, in the bill, it says that we must prioritize green job pathways in disadvantaged communities. Okay, now there's these 3 things that are always painful for the energy sector, but you know, supply chain, especially for all sectors that involve building. I think the supply chain issues we've been experiencing since COVID-19 is a really good example that everything that happens in the world affects everyone. You know, we're not insulated from anything, and as climate crisis you know, becomes worse, our supply chain issues also stand to get worse. So NYPA already has extensive experience building out transmission, and because it's been involved in managing our energy sector for so long, it sort of has a bird's eye view of, you know, what shape the grid is in, what are the challenges, unlike the private developers that are really transnational companies and they just go around trying to build projects everywhere. So they don't have a connection to New York specifically. They also have an economic development arm that we think they should use to ease supply chain constraints by subsidizing a new green manufacturing sector. You know, as a public entity, it is really well poised to do that. And in terms of siting, there are a few things. One is NYPA already owns some land to begin with, which is good. That's not always true for private developers. And one of the big siting issues is many communities oppose projects coming to their neighborhoods, which is really, you know, a cultural thing that unfortunately happens everywhere. But it's really made worse by the fact that nobody trusts private developers, and rightly so. You know, they don't have interest in the communities. You can't trust them to be interested in like how they're gonna give the community benefits from their operation. Usually they show up without much warning, and so everybody feels like they're caught off guard. So with NYPA, there are a few things. One is that if it's not for profit and if it's actually for us, I do think at least half of those people will be less resistant. But it's not, it doesn't always need to build on new properties. You know, there are also existing stalled projects. For example, in Ulster County, we have 2 brownfields where the county wants to turn them into energy projects, but they have to put them on hold because it's too expensive. So that's exactly the kind of projects that NYPA could partner with the county on making it go live. So to recap our demands, we want New York Power Authority to build at least 15 gigawatts of public renewables by 2030, 5 by 2026. We want 25,000 green jobs, and we want to fund training with at least $25 million. We want to use those revenues to cut utility bills in half for those who need it most. One thing here is that right now Central Hudson is reporting such high amount of unpaid bills, and that's a combination of all of the costs going up and people generally not being able to afford their bills, and also their billing errors. People have just lost trust that the bills are actually correct. But what happens is, ultimately, if those are uncollected, ratepayers might have to pay even for that. So if we use these revenues to use the REACH program to provide automatic discounts for low-income households in disadvantaged communities, it's not just helping them, it's helping all of the ratepayers. And then we want to shut down polluting peaker plants. So what's happening next? The reason we are doing this particular themed events in our district right now is because there is a timeline that is dictating, when we should act. So October 8th, NYPA is going to release a draft plan, and that plan will list what they think they are going to build, where, and how. We want to influence that draft plan before it comes out, so we've been organizing really all year long, but we're trying to escalate it right now because it's almost October 8th. And NYPA is listening, but they also need to listen more because what we're asking might not be the thing that they are hearing the most. And then through October and November, we expect them to do hearings on their draft plan. I think they're only doing about 3 across the state, which is way less than what we wanted. But there will be written comments, and we might also see if we want to do our own hearings so that we record them and send it to them, something like that. And on Jan 31st, NYPA will finalize their plan, and that will be what they will build next. So in that plan, what we want to see is 15 gigawatts of energy by 2030 and 5 by 2026. Now, if you want, you can come rally with me in White Plains. That is where NYPA's headquarters is. Their address is 123 Main Street, which I know sounds made up, but that is really their address. And that is the QR code if you want to RSVP to come. And we can always sort of connect people with rides and so on. There are a few people driving down there. Okay. Something you can sign. Lots of people are signing a petition to tell the governor we want her to build public renewables instead of rolling back climate goals. I think we're over 13,000, but it would be great to hit 40,000. So load this QR code on your phone. If you are having an issue, just let us know. We'll give you the URL outside, but also share it. Share it on your social media, share it via emails with your friends, and I'm going to give you a few more seconds to load it. And while we're staring at this QR code, so NYPA has a board of trustees, and they have been meeting regularly, working on their draft plan and so on. But one sort of constraint we're working with is that people who have been working in the energy sector really come from a fossil fuel background, so they're not able to see the path forward in the same way that we do. So part of what we're trying to do is sort of hold their hands along the way so that it's clear what we are saying that they should do. All right, did everybody get this QR code? Mm-hmm. Great. And finally, going back to this, so that was the supply side. Our next big fight is on the delivery side. We're starting with Central Hudson. There are 7 corporate monopolies that are energy delivery utilities across the state. Central Hudson is quite possibly the weakest one, and also the least favored one. Ideally, we would like to transition the state's delivery entirely to the public sector, but we've decided to make Central Hudson the test case. And even though there are many smaller municipal level public utilities in New York, and even though Long Island Power Authority exists in Long Island, that is sort of half public, half private, and they're trying to make it fully public, we really want to show with Central Hudson what can be done. so that that model can be applied elsewhere. So it's, it can be a good test case for the state. But we also know that Los Angeles has a publicly owned utility, Austin does. The energy sector is very challenging. Not saying making it public is going to necessarily solve everything, but it does make everything easier, especially in terms of being able to absorb risks in getting things done based on need rather than profitability. So this is the QR code to put your name to support the bill. Let me know if this is correct, actually. Is it loading correct? Is it loading a big yellow page? Okay, great. Oh, okay, I think this is a slightly outdated slide. So do it from the table outside. It's on the yellow sheet. That one is for this bill. Any questions?
Thank you everyone for coming so much. Obviously this is one of the pressing issues of our time, the transition. This is a town hall, so we want to hear questions from you. I have lots of questions, excellent. So if anyone has questions, I'll go around passing the mic, and if you don't, then I get to ask my questions, which is good too.
I'm just going to point you to the right QR code for this one for now.
That's a question. If the power authority builds that 15 gigawatts of renewables, will that make up for the deficit?
Yes, we think that 15 gigawatts would put us back on track, in the context of everything else that we expect to go online as well. So it would not be the only new energy, but I think it's the minimum the authority should build to get us on track.
Sorry, I'm gonna run around here.
Thank you for the talk, I really enjoyed it. I was curious what you think the role is of holding Central Hudson and other private firms accountable, and how they could maybe, through fees or taxes or something like that, they could help the transition to a public utility system.
Yeah, so we actually think doing that is harder than just buying it out politically. Because there would have to be significant changes to the way they are regulated and to the way we would have to bail them out. And if, Central Hudson is relatively in a weak position now, so that, it's not, it's probable that we would be able to buy it, but of course we would want to gather more data, and, I think the next few years will involve some, more research to get more concrete information. But the acquisition would be pretty straightforward. The legislature would create the Hudson Valley Power Authority, authorize it to acquire Central Hudson. Central Hudson will probably, resist or try to do a lawsuit or whatever it is, which is very, very common. Utilities will spend lots of money lobbying against the bill and so on. But once that's done, the effect of lowering the rates immediately has been pretty consistent in the past when utilities went public, and eliminating the more unmovable pieces in regulation. For example, one unmovable piece is just the high cost of operation if it's a private entity doing it. We might as well just eliminate that source of problem. And the other is, the profit margin. I mean, that's also a significant source of cost for either taxpayers or ratepayers. So I think we would just like to tackle those two things while we're at it.
Hi. First, I appreciate your presentation. I'm Henry Gage. I'm a founder of a nonprofit, Build Green Now. And our primary interest is on reducing solving this on the demand side. And what comes to mind is that it's possible to save energy by going electric, but it does require insulation.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found by looking through the data is that if New York chooses to insulate the homes they have in mind with unregulated spray foam, there's a hidden risk of causing over 200 million metric tons of climate damage. And I'm not sure if anyone's department's actually looking at that. So at some level, we want to sound the alarm.
Yeah.
Fortunately, there is a solution, but then there's a question. The solution that we're seeing is using a product like industrial hemp, which is a product we can grow in New York and install in our homes. The challenge is getting that whole process started. We did build the first hempcrete retrofit in New York, but to really get to the scale that's needed, we should be insulating over 200,000 homes a year if we're going to reach the goal. How would you recommend one pursue financing that can be as easy as a signature? So in other words, is it possible to leverage money that's going to come from the Superfund? Is it possible to get that kind of money through the New York Power Authority, et cetera?
Yeah, so a few things. I think, so Superfund that Henry just referred to is Climate Superfund Act, which we passed and the governor needs to sign. It's a retroactive tax on the top most polluting corporations, Exxonmobil and so on, that would generate some revenues towards our climate resiliency plan, which is price tagged at $200 billion, and that would help us with, I think, around 30% of that. So my understanding of the Superfund is that it's already claimed for, right? There's like specific things we need to do out of that money. However, we are working on, there are a few different bills on retrofit, and we actually have one called Livable New York where we are working on it as also a job creation opportunity, but the goal of it is to make retrofit money available because that is the biggest challenge. The reason you can't get it so easily with the signatures is because the money has not been allocated, so that could be like a budget fight. But the other thing is we also have been pushing, and this is also a relatively new bill called Green Social Housing. We want the state to create a social housing authority because it has the housing sector has the same problem as the energy, which is the private sector is not cutting it, right? We need a public investment in homes. And this bill is a very comprehensive bill that looks at things like the best materials we could be using, especially local material, because we have the supply chain issue, we have the workforce issue, which is the same as every other sector. It involves both building new homes, but also working on existing homes, converting vacant homes into livable homes and so on. And this, we think, is like a 5-year fight, but there's a lot of interest in it. I would love for it to be a 3-year fight. But we want New York to build these homes that people can live in. And also the rent is capped at 25% of people's income, and you can't get, you don't have to maintain anything to live there. Once you're in there, it's really meant to be a home. And there's also some component for co-ops and so on. And actually just today, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez introduced the federal companion bill for this, which is primarily about investing federal dollars in this terrain of green homes, especially homes meant to be affordable. So I think my short answer is we're trying to make it come. We're trying to make it rain for ideas like yours. So yeah.
That's very encouraging. I saw something else where you and Senator Hinch were working on a plan that focused on training for boards and et cetera, that it was going to be a requirement for them to have a certain number of hours a year of training. I wanted to suggest, is it possible to expand upon that kind of vision in order to accelerate the kind of work headed toward where we can ideally go? What I mean by that is, in order for people to quickly understand the materials like hemp lime as an insulating material, we found the best strategy is through training. The local fire department is asked for training. There's 300 of them, so we can't do that part for free. And there's 62 counties. So the thought is it possible to go after some of the money that is found in the training budget for first responders in order to get this information to each of the 62 counties? Like in the case of Ulster, I think they're finishing the year with a leftover of something like 15,000.
Yeah. So the first responders are also in a big financial crisis right now. There's lack of EMS services, and generally people are having a hard time getting the volunteers, expanding their facility. Like for example in Tivoli, they're trying to expand their facility, but they have not been able to get all the money, and they're like piecemealing different sources of money. So that's on the fire departments and the first responders and so on, which is another slice of problem. But in bills like Livable New York, which is the one I talked about earlier, I think going forward, because of this worker shortage that everybody is aware of, and also because there's equity built into our climate law, training is always going to be in there, like it is in our bill, for example. And unions who build really want the state to support their apprenticeship programs. So for you, actually, if you haven't already talked to unions, I would encourage doing that as well, because it could be incorporated into like the carpenters union work, or the other trade unions. But yes, so going forward, training is going to be an unavoidable piece that will always be in these built out bills.
Yeah, just so you know, we are working with math, but the money's like really slow.
That's the theme. Yes. We need more money. And it is there, by the way. I will just say the budget fight is coming up in January again. The money is there. The will to spend it wisely is not there. Somebody else, yes.
Yeah. Is there a comparable that you use for conversion to publicly owned from investor-owned utilities that would be germane for Central Hudson?
Yes, I mean, we're trying to do it at a bigger scale, which is the entire Central Hudson territory, which compared to other territories is still smaller, so it's a nice size. But the story I always like to refer to is the town of Messina, New York. So they did it at the town level. It was a 7-year fight. Apparently families were torn apart because they disagreed on the issue. They were thrown legal challenges and whatnot, but they did win, and it was an absolutely smooth transition. Nobody thinks about their energy bills there anymore, and the workers that opposed it initially, they're fine. They like their job just fine. So we want to do it at a bigger scale. I think you had a question too, right?
Yeah. Can you just speak quickly to the 15 gigawatts of renewables? Like, what, if you had to say or like predict what the breakdown between different types of renewables would be, and is there any like interest or effort to get, I don't know, new nuclear or like energy storage as part of that? And then secondly, I was curious about the comparisons to the Long Island Power Authority, and if you could just sort of, in broad strokes, compare and contrast your vision for the Hudson Valley version of that compared to how they've done that and sort of the hybrid approach there.
Sure. So to start with, okay, wait, you have a two-part.
Breakdown of the 2030.
The 2030, right? Okay. So because the state does not consider nuclear renewable, that's not going to affect the 2030 goal, because that's really for wind, solar, geothermal, and so on. And the governor has been very interested in wind. So right now, a lot of energy, I don't want to do puns. A lot of focus is on wind, especially like on Long Island, right? But where we are in the Hudson Valley, we would really be most effective for energy storage, for solar, and also actually in our bill, one of the things that, so if you look at this thing, one of the pages has highlights of some of the main components of the bill. Right now, distributed energy is also hampered by utilities like Central Hudson, because they don't really like having to pay just your normal ratepayers for the energy they're generating in their solar and so on. And we want to fix that as well. And then there's geothermal, there's microgrids, but we also consider geothermal to count towards this 2030, and that is another thing that can be done more universally. It's less location focused. So I'd say wind is up there, then solar and geothermal, and energy storage we just need everywhere. Oh, you had a second part.
Long Island.
Long Island, yes, okay. So Long Island Power Authority was created in the 90s, and it was created under a very specific circumstance, which is the utility they replaced was completely failing, like at a next level compared to Central Hudson, much worse situation. And they are also, weather-wise, in a much more vulnerable location, right? Long Island is very exposed. So they bought out the private utility and replaced it with Long Island Power Authority. But in its implementation, one thing that happened immediately is that they made it a public-private partnership where they contracted out the operation of it to a private sector. And many people oppose that, but what that ended up doing is it made it this public-private quasi-entity, but it didn't eliminate the challenges of the private sector, you know? So it was not fully public. So fast forward, earlier this year, the task force released their recommendation because there's been a steady campaign to make it fully public. And the task force recommended that it should be fully public, that it's the only path forward. And this is not even necessarily a leftist task force, it's your run-of-the-mill opinion, but they really recommended it should be fully public. And something that they proposed that we are retaining in our bill, which is a really good idea, is to only keep the workers under the private sector because we want to preserve their right to strike. In New York, if you're a public worker, you cannot strike. And Long Island legislators were supposed to introduce the bill in the state legislature to implement the task force's recommendation. Then politics happened, and my colleague Fred Thiel in the Assembly did very enthusiastically introduce it, but it was never introduced in the Senate, and Fred is retiring after this session, so don't know what's going to happen, but Long Island has very difficult politics, and there are also many legislators there, whereas in the Central Hudson Territory, we're only looking at, a handful of legislators, so that dynamic is slightly different. But I think the lesson is don't do public-private partnership.
Well, I have a question about the Inflation Reduction Act. This is the act is sort of tapped into those resources and that framework in an interesting way. And I'm wondering, I feel most people think of it as a way of de-risking just the private sector. And I'm wondering if you can speak in a national sense, if this is an approach that could be replicated in other places, in other states, or if this is sort of unique to New York's regulatory framework in the NYPA.
I would say even though New York Power Authority exists uniquely in New York, the lack of something similar in other states is not necessarily a deal breaker. It is fairly straightforward to create a new state authority to the state legislature. So the will to do it would have to exist, and Inflation Reduction Act is a huge carrot to do it because of all of the direct payment provisions in there. And one challenge with the Inflation Reduction Act is that it's so expensive, people don't really know what's in there. It's supposed to be a blank check, but we're always trying to figure out how a particular project should access it. But if another state wanted to do it, they could absolutely do it. And on the delivery side, the regulations are very similar nationally.
Do you have any other questions?
I have another broad question. My impression is that California and Texas seem to be building a lot more renewables than New York. One, is my impression correct? And two, does the stuff that we're talking about now relate to those results? Or if not, what is causing a lot more solar in California and wind and solar in Texas?
California just has very different politics. New York is strangely not, less FDR, but since then, not very forward state. We are often very behind California on many things. On many things, we're even behind New Jersey and other East Coast states. So, but I think you're right. I mean, Ben, I think California and Texas, to my knowledge, they're making more renewables than New York. But what we have, probably where New York is more forward is in our labor protections that we passed, and I think our goals are more forward. But it always, I always find it fun to tell people, quiz them on which state has no investor-owned utilities, because it's Nebraska. And I truly believe this is when you get down to it, it is a bipartisan issue, and if you look at the history of public power, in the early 1900s, when there was a big fight in Ontario, Canada, the Liberals opposed it. The Liberals sided with utilities, and the Conservatives wanted it to be public, and the Liberals lost their election because they sided with the utility. So, you know, we've as an office, we've also been trying to show that threat to our Republican colleagues, for example, and they are not necessarily opposed. They know it's popular. They also know it might be necessary if they're never able to solve the problems that are facing us. I will say that, you know, sometimes they do this performance of, you know, what about global justice? Where are we going to get all the lithium and things like that? But we also know that we have to be smart about our energy load. Like, I don't think we should be wasting it on ChatGPT and these microchip centers. You know, we should be building public transit infrastructure. We should be greening homes. So there's also the other component of setting the priority for how we should be using energy, because we don't necessarily want to be this extractive, you know, endless extractive machine either. But we do need the transition nonetheless.
I have one more question just on the legislative side. You know, I'm wondering if there's a coalitional difference. You know, I know this came up in 2021 as well, the VPRA, and why do you think, like, what made it, what was successful about the 2023 effort, and how did that come about?
Yeah, okay, so a few, you know, because I was there really like in the early phase of the campaign. I started volunteering with the Public Power Coalition in 2020, and when I joined, the status was they had written a somewhat very different and honestly a worse bill before the pandemic. And the pandemic gave the coalition the chance to sort of regather and write a much better bill. So when I joined, you know, the coalition was in the process of really finalizing this bill and talking to legislators about it. And it has lots of environmental justice groups and, you know, leftist groups. For example, many Democratic Socialists of America chapters are part of this coalition. So it's a good range of orgs that are in this coalition. And, you know, because of that, we really believe in inside-outside strategy and in mass politics, right? We're not trying to pass these bills through some like secret, you know, closed-door conversations. We're trying to pass these with like the public's buy-in. So there were lots of efforts to really make the demand strong on the outside, but also have electeds on the inside that could be your insider allies. And when I ran, the year I ran, you know, on the DSA slate, there were several insurgent candidates running. We all campaigned on this bill. The reason we campaigned on this bill was because we knew that even election can be a tool for passing policy, and if we made it the mandate of that election year, then we could send a message. Thankfully, I won. And my election was actually, because it was also not in a big city, you know, in a primarily rural and suburban area, it really did rattle Albany in terms of looking at this bill. And so having, you know, now being on the inside, there's so much follow-up and persistent organizing you can do on the inside to make sure things are moving, because the truth is we're looking at like thousands of bills at a time. You know, and it's all about which bills you want to prioritize and you want to bring the focus on and put it on the agenda for the legislature. So we were really able to do this, you know, in the Senate, in the Assembly, but also in the governor's office, which is why it passed. But it also really helped to be ahead in the data game. You know, like, for example, saying how much the gap is going to be before the state had that information.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
I will just say one thing. There are so many things going on right now. I'm so glad that you chose to care about the status of the state's climate goals this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank